Eric had always dreamed of visiting London, and when he finally arrived, he couldn't wait to see the famous royal guards at Buckingham Palace. He had heard all sorts of stories about how these soldiers would stand still for hours, no matter what happened around them. Most tourists came to take pictures, marvel at the uniforms, or try to get a reaction out of the guards. But Eric wasn't like the others. He wanted to do something memorable. As he walked through the crowded streets, Eric's mind started racing with ideas. I bet I could make them break their composure, he thought, a grin spreading across his face. He wasn't interested in history or tradition, but he was sure his friends would find it funny if he pulled off something outrageous. I'll show them how funny I am, he mumbled to himself. After waiting in line with the other tourists, Eric found himself standing behind a metal barricade that separated the crowd from the palace grounds. The royal guards, dressed in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, stood motionless. They had been stationed in the same spot for what seemed like hours, barely moving, their eyes focused straight ahead. As Eric watched, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. They look so serious, he whispered to his friend, who was nervously shifting from foot to foot beside him. Let's see how serious they are when they see this. Before his friend could protest, Eric reached into his backpack and pulled out a half-empty soda can. He had finished his drink earlier, but had kept the can as a joke. This is going to be hilarious, Eric thought. He stood up straight, making sure people around him were watching, and shouted, "Hey, guard, catch this." With a playful grin, he tossed the can toward one of the soldiers, aiming to make it land near his feet. The can bounced on the ground, making the soft clink, but the soldier didn't flinch. He didn't even look down at the trash. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his eyes locked ahead, as if nothing had happened. The crowd fell silent, confused. Some tourists exchanged glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Others started muttering, shaking their heads in disapproval. Eric, however, was still feeling confident. He was sure the guard would break his composure and react in some way, but the soldier stood like a statue. Undeterred, Eric smirked and waved the can in the air. "Look at this guy," he called out louder now. "He doesn't even care. How boring." His voice carried over the crowd, and some people even chuckled nervously. But most of the tourists looked away, uncomfortable with his actions. Eric's friend, who had been quiet up until this point, finally spoke up. "Dude, this is really disrespectful. You should stop." But Eric didn't listen. He was enjoying the attention and the small crowd that had gathered around him. He took out his phone and started recording, convinced this moment would go viral on social media. "This is going to be so funny," he said, still laughing. "This guy's just standing there. What's the point of being a royal guard if you can't even react?" As the moments passed, more tourists watched Eric. Some of them began to murmur, saying that what he was doing wasn't right. A few even shook their heads and walked away. It seemed that the crowd was starting to turn against him. But Eric didn't care. He was on a mission to make people laugh, and as far as he was concerned, he was succeeding. What Eric didn't realize was that his actions were far from funny to the people who took their role seriously. Beyond the busy crowd, hidden high above in the surveillance room, security personnel were watching the whole scene unfold. They were trained to deal with these situations and knew exactly how to handle troublemakers. But Eric, lost in his own world, had no idea that he was being closely observed. A few minutes later, something unexpected happened. One of the palace gates, which had been closed, creaked open. A tall figure, a senior royal guard dressed in a slightly different uniform, stepped out. His presence was commanding, and the crowd instinctively parted to make way. He glanced over at Eric, his eyes sharp, and began walking toward him. Eric, still unaware of the seriousness of his actions, turned to his friend and said, "Oh, looks like I'm about to get some attention." The guard stopped in front of Eric, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he said, his voice steady and firm, "we need to have a word." Eric froze when he heard the guard's voice. It wasn't loud or angry, but it carried a weight of authority that made his stomach drop. He glanced around quickly, noticing that the crowd had begun to quiet down. People were watching, and some even had their phones out, filming. The last thing Eric wanted was to be seen as a fool in front of a crowd. He tried to act casual, shrugging and saying, "Hey, no harm done, right?" But the guard didn't smile. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, as if he had heard all kinds of excuses before. Without a word, the senior guard motioned for Eric to follow him, turning toward a quieter area away from the busy crowd. Eric hesitated for a moment, glancing at his friend. His friend, now looking concerned, mouthed, "Maybe you should just go." But Eric, still too proud and embarrassed to back down, followed the guard. They walked a short distance, past the ornate gates, and into a secluded spot, where the only sound was the quiet hum of the London traffic in the distance. The senior guard stopped and faced Eric. His eyes were steady, but not unkind. He wasn't yelling or threatening, but there was an unmistakable sense of seriousness in his tone. "Do you know what you just did?" the guard asked, his voice calm but firm. Eric shrugged again, trying to brush off the situation. "I just threw a can. It's not a big deal," he said, his voice sounding a little unsure now. The guard didn't react to Eric's response. Instead, he took a deep breath, his gaze not leaving Eric's face. "Do you understand what it means to be a royal guard?" he asked. Eric was quiet for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He'd seen the guards standing still at the palace before, but he had never really thought much about their role. He just thought they were a part of the scenery. "They're not just standing there for fun," the guard continued. "The guards you see here are symbols of this country's history and tradition. They have sworn an oath to serve the crown with discipline, honor, and respect. They represent something far bigger than themselves. Every action they take, every minute they spend standing here, has meaning." Eric felt a little uncomfortable now. He had never considered the deeper significance of the royal guards before. He was starting to feel guilty, like maybe he had crossed a line he didn't understand. The guard wasn't yelling at him, but his words carried weight, making Eric realize that this wasn't just about a can of soda. It was about respect. The senior guard took another step closer, but his tone remained even. "You might think it's funny to mess with someone who's standing still, but you have no idea what it takes to do that job. These men stand guard in all kinds of weather, with no break. They don't flinch, they don't move, because their duty is bigger than themselves." Eric shifted uncomfortably, now feeling the weight of his actions. He had thought of the guard as just part of the tourist experience, a person to entertain the crowd. But now he saw things differently. The idea of standing still for hours without a single movement, all while knowing the eyes of thousands of people were watching, suddenly seemed a lot more difficult. The guard's voice softened, but still carried authority. "What you did was disrespectful to not only the guards, but also to the people who respect them and what they represent. I'm giving you a chance to make it right. Apologize and show that you understand." Eric wasn't sure what to say at first. He had never imagined that throwing a soda can could lead to this. But as he thought about the guard's words, he started to feel truly embarrassed. He had acted out of impulse and thought it would be funny, but now he understood that he had disrespected something important. I'm sorry," Eric said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't think about it that way. I wasn't trying to disrespect anyone." The guard nodded, as though he had heard such apologies before. "I appreciate that. Now there's one more thing." Eric looked at him, confused. "What's that?" The guard paused for a moment, considering. "You'll have to clean up the mess you made. Not just the can you threw, but the litter around here as well." Eric blinked, not sure he had heard him correctly. "Wait, you want me to clean up?" The guard's expression didn't change. "Yes, I think it will help you understand the importance of taking responsibility for your actions." For a moment, Eric was speechless. He didn't know if he should feel grateful or annoyed. But when he looked into the guard's eyes, he saw nothing but sincerity. The senior guard wasn't trying to punish him out of spite. He was trying to teach him something. Finally, Eric sighed, realizing there was no way out. "Okay," he said, his voice softer. "I'll clean up." The guard gave him a small nod, then turned to walk back toward the palace gates. Eric, still processing everything that had happened, slowly followed. As he picked up the empty bottles and wrappers scattered around the area, he couldn't help but think about how one moment of thoughtlessness had led to a lesson he would never forget. As Eric picked up the trash scattered around Buckingham Palace, he couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The guard's words kept echoing in his mind. He had never imagined that something so small, like tossing an empty soda can, would lead to a conversation like this. The senior guard had led him back to where he had thrown the can, and now Eric was kneeling on the pavement, collecting the litter while tourists continued to walk by. Some people stared at him with curious looks, while others whispered to each other, clearly watching the young man who had once seemed so confident. Eric felt the heat rise in his cheeks, the embarrassment settling in. With each piece of trash he picked up, his mind began to clear. He could see the royal guards now in a new light. Before, they had just seemed like a part of the tourist attractions, something to take a picture with or laugh about. But now, he understood how much dedication went into standing there for hours, no matter how many people mocked or tested them. It wasn't just a job, it was a responsibility. As he worked, Eric felt a growing sense of respect for the soldiers he had disrespected. He had been quick to judge, thinking it was all just a game. But now, after the guard had spoken to him, Eric realized how wrong he had been. He wasn't sure what kind of person he had become in that moment, but he knew he didn't want to be the kind of person who made others feel small. His friend, still watching from a distance, had remained silent for the most part. But Eric could tell that his friend was uncomfortable with the whole situation. At first, he had been too nervous to step in. But now, as he watched Eric clean up the mess, a mix of confusion and sympathy showed on his face. "You all right, man?" his friend finally asked, walking over to him. Eric stopped for a moment, wiping his forehead, and glanced up at his friend. "Yeah, I think so," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. I messed up." His friend nodded, a little relieved to hear Eric admit it. "I mean, I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but it's clear now that you crossed the line." Eric couldn't help but agree. "I didn't realize what I was doing. I thought it would be funny. I didn't even think about how serious their job is." He paused, looking down at the ground. "Now I feel like an idiot." His friend didn't say anything for a while, just watching him as he continued to clean up the litter. The tourists who passed by seemed to notice, some glancing over at Eric with a mix of judgment and pity. Eric wasn't sure if they were judging him for being disrespectful or feeling sorry for him for having to clean up the mess. Either way, he couldn't help but feel like he had lost something that day. His sense of pride, maybe, or at least the carefree attitude that had led him to do something so childish. The senior guard, who had been watching from a distance, approached Eric again after a few minutes. His face had softened a little, and there was a slight nod of approval as he saw how much effort Eric was putting into cleaning up. "You've made good progress," the guard said, his voice calm and steady. "It's not easy, is it?" Eric shook his head, feeling the weight of his words. "No, it's not." He didn't want to admit it, but the cleanup had given him a lot of time to think. He had learned something important, something he could never have understood unless he had taken responsibility for his actions. The guard had been right all along. This wasn't just about a can of soda. It was about understanding the value of respect and the impact of your actions on others. Once Eric had finished cleaning up, he stood up and looked at the senior guard. "Thank you," he said quietly, though the words didn't feel like enough. "I won't forget this." The guard gave him a nod, his face still serious but not unkind. "Remember this lesson. It's not too late to learn what respect really means. And sometimes, it's the little things that show how much you've grown." Eric stood there for a moment, feeling both humbled and relieved. He knew that this was one of those moments that would stick with him forever. The tourists had long since moved on, and the crowd around him had thinned, but Eric wasn't in any rush to leave. The world around him felt different now, quieter somehow. As the senior guard turned to walk away, Eric called out to him, "Do you think I could apologize to the other guards?" The senior guard stopped and looked back at him, surprised by the question. "I think that would be a good idea," he said with a slight smile. "It shows you're taking responsibility." Eric nodded, knowing that no matter how much it embarrassed him, he needed to make it right. He wasn't sure if the other guards would accept his apology, but he felt it was important to try. With that, he turned to his friend, who was still standing nearby, watching him carefully. "Let's go find the others," Eric said, feeling a sense of determination that he hadn't felt before. It was time to make amends and prove that he could do better. Eric took a deep breath as he walked back towards the main gates of Buckingham Palace. His mind was racing with thoughts, but there was a calmness now that wasn't there before. Cleaning up the mess had made him think deeply about what had happened. He had learned a lot in the past hour. He had been reckless, immature, and disrespectful without understanding the impact of his actions. Now, though, he was determined to make things right. As they walked back through the crowds, Eric and his friend didn't talk much. Eric's friend, who had been supportive but unsure about how to handle the situation, gave him a nod. He seemed to understand that this wasn't just a random tourist moment anymore. This had become a lesson. Eric had learned something important, but he also knew that saying sorry wasn't enough. He needed to show that he truly understood what he had done. When they reached the area where the royal guards stood, Eric took another deep breath. The guards were still as stiff and unmoving as ever, standing at attention like statues. Their faces were serious, and their postures perfect. Eric had seen them many times before, but now he was paying attention to every little detail, the way their boots were polished, the precise way their uniforms were fitted. It was clear they weren't just playing a role for tourists. They were soldiers with a sense of duty that went far beyond what he had first imagined. Eric's eyes scanned the area, looking for the senior guard who had spoken to him earlier. He spotted him standing near the gates, talking to another officer. Eric walked over slowly, feeling a mix of nervousness and guilt. He didn't know how the other guards would react. He wasn't sure if they would even accept his apology. After all, what he had done was disrespectful, and it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. The senior guard noticed Eric approaching and gave him a small nod, signaling that he could come closer. The two stood there for a moment, the sound of distant conversations and camera flashes filling the air. Eric's heart was beating faster than usual. He had never been in a situation like this before, one where his actions had consequences he hadn't fully considered. Taking another step forward, Eric cleared his throat. "Excuse me, sir," he began, his voice a little shaky. "I just wanted to say that I'm really sorry for what I did earlier. I didn't understand how serious this job is, and I was disrespectful. I know I shouldn't have thrown the can, and I hope you can accept my apology." The senior guard nodded again, but his expression didn't change. He didn't smile, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, maybe approval or just acknowledgement. "I appreciate you coming back to say that," he said in a low, steady voice. "It shows maturity to admit when you're wrong." Eric felt a weight lift off his shoulders at those words, but he knew this wasn't over yet. The real challenge would be with the other guards. After all, the senior guard wasn't the only one who had seen what he did. He had thrown the can near the feet of a soldier who had stood there without flinching. But now, Eric felt a responsibility to make it right, not just to the senior guard, but to all of them. "Would it be okay if I spoke to the other guards?" Eric asked hesitantly, looking around at the soldiers who were still standing perfectly still, ignoring the crowd. "I want to apologize to them too. I know I disrespected them as well." The senior guard considered this for a moment before giving a slight nod. It's not always easy for guards to accept apologies, especially when they're in the middle of their duty. But if you're sincere, they might listen. With that, Eric stepped forward, closer to the group of royal guards. He could feel his palms getting sweaty, his nerves still high despite his decision to face them. As he approached, the guards didn't move, didn't even look in his direction. They stood there, as if in their own world, focused on their duty. For a moment, it felt like Eric was invisible, like they didn't even notice him. But Eric knew that wasn't the case. They had seen him. They had witnessed his actions. And now he had to show them that he understood. He took a deep breath and spoke loudly enough for them to hear him, though his voice still trembled a little. "I'm really sorry for what I did earlier," Eric said, his words sincere. "I acted thoughtlessly, and I know it wasn't just about throwing a can. It was about respect. And I didn't respect what you do, or the work you put in. I was wrong." The guards remained silent for a long moment. Eric felt a knot in his stomach as he waited for a response. He wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe they would ignore him or give him a cold stare. But he had already committed to making things right. And no matter what happened next, he was going to stand there until they knew how sorry he was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the guards shifted slightly. His face remained as stern as ever, but his voice was clear when he spoke. "Apology accepted," the guard said. "We don't expect everyone to understand our role, but it's good that you came back to show respect. Not many people would do that." Eric's heart lifted slightly at those words, but he knew this wasn't a complete victory. It wasn't enough to just apologize. He had to continue proving that he had learned from the experience. But for now, this was a start. And that small step felt like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at the guards. This time, he didn't see them as just statues or part of the palace's decorations. He saw them as real people, doing a job that required more dedication and discipline than he could have ever imagined. And for the first time since the incident, Eric felt a deep sense of respect, not just for the guards, but for the idea of duty itself. As Eric walked away from the royal guards, he felt a sense of relief, but there was something else too, something deeper. The apology had felt like the right thing to do, but it also made him reflect on his actions in a way he hadn't before. He wasn't just sorry for throwing the can. He was sorry for not realizing the bigger picture, for not thinking before he acted. He had taken so much for granted, thinking that everything around him was just part of the show. Now he understood how wrong he had been. His friend had been watching the whole time. Eric noticed that he had been standing a little farther back, giving him space to handle the situation. When Eric caught up with him, his friend gave him a curious look. "So, how'd it go?" his friend asked, a little unsure. Eric shrugged, trying to hide how much the whole experience had affected him. "It's fine. I think they accepted my apology. They didn't seem angry, just serious." His friend nodded, though he still seemed a little confused by the whole situation. "I don't get it. Why'd you have to apologize to all of them? It's not like they were going to really care." Eric smiled faintly. "It wasn't about them caring or not. It was about me showing that I understand what I did, that I learned from it." His friend gave him a puzzled look, but Eric could tell he was starting to get it. Sometimes, it took an experience like this to open your eyes to things you never considered before. Eric knew that the incident with the guard would stay with him forever. The whole situation had turned out to be more than just a lesson in respect. It had forced him to look at his own character, at how he had been quick to judge others without knowing anything about them. Before, he would have just laughed off the idea of respecting people like the royal guards, thinking that their job was just standing still. But now, he realized that their job was much harder than he had ever imagined. They didn't stand there as part of some tourist show. They did it out of duty and dedication, despite being treated like background figures in a city full of tourists. As they walked away from the palace grounds, Eric's thoughts kept circling back to the idea of duty. It wasn't just about what the guards did, but about how everyone had a responsibility to act with integrity. He had learned that actions have consequences, whether you understand them or not. But more importantly, he had learned that there was always an opportunity to do better, to make things right, and to learn from your mistakes. They made their way down the busy street, blending into the crowd of tourists. The atmosphere felt a little different now, though. The noise of the city, the constant chatter, and the hustle and bustle didn't seem as overwhelming anymore. Eric had gained a new perspective on things, something that made the world seem quieter, more thoughtful. He noticed things that he hadn't before, the way people looked at each other, the effort that went into keeping everything running smoothly, and how small actions could make a big difference. Eric's friend finally broke the silence. "You really learned something, huh?" he asked, his tone more curious than before. Eric looked at him and nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I did. I never really thought about how something as small as tossing a can could affect other people. I thought it was funny, but now I know better." His friend grinned, clearly happy that Eric had gained something positive from the experience. "Well, I think it's cool that you apologized. A lot of people wouldn't do that, even if they knew they were wrong." Eric smiled back, feeling a little lighter. "Yeah, well, I didn't want to just forget about it. I messed up, but I don't want to just let that be the end of it. I want to learn from it." As they continued walking through the streets of London, Eric found himself thinking about how this experience had changed him. He didn't feel like the same person who had tossed the can just a few hours ago. He felt more aware, more mindful of the way his actions could affect others. It wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about taking responsibility and making sure that you didn't make the same mistake again. They decided to grab a bite to eat at a small cafe nearby, and as they sat down to enjoy their meal, Eric couldn't stop thinking about the Royal Guard. What he had done that day wasn't just a mistake. It had been a chance to learn something important. It had been a reminder that everyone, no matter their job or role, deserves respect. And the real strength came not from standing still, but from showing humility and responsibility when you were wrong. For the first time, Eric realized how much he had to learn about the world around him. His perspective on life was shifting, and he knew that the lesson he had learned that day would stick with him for the rest of his life. He was grateful for it, grateful for the chance to grow, to change, and to become a better version of himself. The next few days passed, but the experience Eric had in front of Buckingham Palace stayed fresh in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about it, no matter how many times he tried to focus on other things. Every time he went out, he found himself paying more attention to how people treated each other, how small gestures could make a difference. He was beginning to see the world in a way he never had before. It wasn't just about being polite anymore. It was about respect, and it went deeper than that. Respect wasn't something you could turn on and off when it was convenient. It wasn't about how you acted when people were watching. It was about how you treated others when no one was around. Eric had always thought of respect as something simple, but now he saw it as something complex, something that had to be earned and constantly shown through actions. That afternoon, Eric and his friend went for a walk around London, chatting and taking in the sights. The weather had turned a little colder, but it didn't seem to matter. The busy streets of the city felt different now to Eric. It wasn't just a place of tourists and busy people. It was a place where everyone had their own life, their own struggles, and their own story. For the first time, Eric felt like he wasn't just a passerby in a crowd. He felt connected to it, even if only a little bit. As they walked through Covent Garden, Eric couldn't help but notice a street performer. The man was playing the guitar, his fingers moving skillfully over the strings. A small crowd had gathered around him, watching and clapping along to the rhythm. Eric and his friend stopped for a moment to listen, but something caught Eric's attention. The way people around the performer seemed to ignore him, almost as if he was invisible. They were too busy with their phones, distracted by the noise of the street, or talking to each other. They weren't paying any real attention to the performer, and it bothered Eric. "Do you see that?" Eric asked his friend, nodding toward the performer. His friend glanced over at him, following his gaze. "Yeah, they don't even seem to care. It's like he's just background noise." Eric frowned, but then something clicked. "Exactly," he said. turning to face his friend. That's what it feels like when you don't show respect. The performer's giving everything he has, and people are just ignoring it. They don't even realize how much effort goes into what he's doing. It's the same thing I did with the guard. His friend raised an eyebrow, not fully understanding. What do you mean? Eric looked at the performer again, but his thoughts were on the royal guard. I didn't really get it before. I thought their job was just standing still all day. But it's more than that. They're doing their duty, just like this guy is playing his music. But if no one acknowledges it, it's like it's not even happening. His friend nodded slowly, the idea starting to sink in. So you're saying that respect is more than just saying sorry. It's about really seeing what people do and acknowledging it, right? Eric smiled, grateful that his friend was starting to understand. Yeah, exactly. It's easy to ignore people when you don't know their story or what they're doing. But when you take a moment to really see them, to understand what they're offering, that's when you show real respect. They both stood there for a moment, watching the street performer as he continued to play. More people had gathered around him now, tossing coins into his guitar case, but still, most of the crowd wasn't fully engaged. They were just there because it was something to look at, not because they really saw the man playing. Eric realized how often he had been like that, surrounded by people, but not really noticing them. It was easy to do when you were distracted by your own life, but now he knew that it wasn't the right way to live. We've all been that guy, Eric said softly, almost to himself. We've all just walked by, not seeing the person giving their all. It's not just about the guard or the performer. It's about how we treat everyone, every day. His friend didn't say anything for a moment, but Eric could tell that he was thinking. They stood there for a little longer, watching the crowd and the performer, before Eric finally spoke again. I think it's time for me to start seeing people, really seeing them, not just as background noise. His friend gave him a thoughtful look, but nodded in agreement. Yeah, I get it. I think we all need to do that more. The rest of the day was spent walking around the city, exploring different parts of London. Eric found himself more aware of the people around him than ever before. He didn't just look at them as part of the background. He noticed the buskers on the street, the vendors selling food, the elderly couple sitting on a bench. He even noticed the workers cleaning the streets, picking up litter, and making sure the city stayed beautiful for everyone. It wasn't just about the big moments anymore. It was about all the small things that made the world work. By the time they headed back to their hotel, Eric was exhausted but content. He had learned more than he had expected to during his trip, and he knew that what had happened at Buckingham Palace had changed him. It had taught him a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life: the importance of respect and awareness. The small actions, the small gestures, they all mattered. And the real beauty in life came from recognizing that. As Eric sat down on the hotel bed that night, he thought about everything he had seen and learned. He couldn't change the past, but he could control the way he moved forward. And from that moment on, he promised himself that he would never again take the people around him for granted. He would see them, acknowledge them, and treat them with the respect they deserved. As the days passed, Eric couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. What started as a simple, thoughtless action had turned into a life-changing experience. Every time he thought back to that moment in front of Buckingham Palace, he couldn't believe how much he had learned. It wasn't just about throwing a can or apologizing. It was about understanding the deeper meaning behind respect, responsibility, and how his actions affected the world around him. He had spent so much of his life going through the motions, acting without thinking, taking people and things for granted. But now he understood that the little things mattered more than he had ever realized. The royal guards, the street performers, the cleaners, and even the tourists around him, they all played a role in making the world function, and everyone deserved respect, whether they were in the spotlight or behind the scenes. A week later, Eric and his friend were sitting in a cafe, relaxing after a day of sightseeing. Eric was looking out the window, watching the people pass by. But this time, He wasn't just watching. He was seeing. He noticed a man walking with a heavy bag, his shoulders slumped under the weight. He saw a woman holding the door for an elderly man, smiling as he walked through. And he noticed a couple of teenagers sitting on a bench, laughing and joking with each other, their faces bright with joy. Eric's friend, who had been listening to a story he was telling, paused when he saw Eric staring out the window. "What's on your mind?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Eric smiled, feeling a sense of peace. "Just thinking," he said. "I've been thinking a lot lately about how we all have a part to play. Everyone does. It's easy to forget that, you know." His friend chuckled. "You've really changed, huh? Just a few days ago, you were the one who didn't care about any of this." Eric nodded, looking back at him. "Yeah, I guess I've learned a lot. It's funny how one moment can change the way you see everything." His friend shook his head in disbelief. "I never thought that throwing a can at a royal guard would lead to all this. But I can see it now. You've really thought about it." Eric's eyes were bright, full of the understanding he had gained in the past week. "I've been thinking about all the people we walk by every day. The ones we don't notice. The ones we forget. I didn't even see them before. But now I do." His friend leaned back in his chair, impressed by how much Eric had changed. "Well, I guess I've learned something too. I've been guilty of just going through the motions, like you said. Maybe we should all stop and pay more attention to the little things, to the people around us." Eric smiled at his friend, grateful for the understanding. "Exactly. It's about realizing that every action we take, every person we meet, it all matters. We can make the world a better place just by seeing the people around us and treating them with respect. Not just the ones we think are important, but everyone." They sat in silence for a while, sipping their drinks and watching the world go by. Eric had always thought of himself as just another tourist in a busy city, but now he saw things differently. He realized that he was part of a bigger picture, just like everyone else. The royal guards, the street performers, the cafe workers, they were all part of this city, playing their own role. And Eric was part of it too. Later that afternoon, Eric decided to go back to Buckingham Palace. He felt a strange sense of peace when he thought about the royal guards. It wasn't just about the apology anymore. It was about how much he had learned, how much he had grown in such a short time. As he walked back to the gates, he couldn't help but smile to himself. The guards were still standing there, as rigid and focused as ever, doing their job with the same dedication. This time, when Eric saw them, he didn't feel nervous or embarrassed. He didn't feel like an outsider or like he had to apologize again. Instead, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for the lesson they had unknowingly taught him. He took a moment to stand there, just watching them, acknowledging the work they did, the history they represented, and the importance of their presence. It wasn't about making up for his past mistake anymore. It was about recognizing the value of what they were doing, understanding that everyone had a role to play. Even the smallest actions, like standing still and guarding the palace, were important in their own way. Eric had learned that sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the simplest things. As he walked away from Buckingham Palace, he felt a deep sense of contentment. He knew that he had changed. He had become someone who saw the world differently, not just the big, dramatic moments, but the quiet, everyday ones too. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there would be times when he still made mistakes, but he also knew that he would always try to learn from them. And with each lesson, he would become a little bit better, a little bit more aware of the people around him, and a little bit more connected to the world. As Eric left London a few days later, he felt grateful. Grateful for the city, for the people he had met, and for the lesson that had changed his life. He knew that no matter where he went next, he would carry the lesson with him. Respect wasn't just about saying the right words. It was about seeing the world and the people in it, understanding their value, and showing appreciation every day. And for the rest of his life, he would remember the royal guard, the street performer, and all the quiet heroes who played their part in the world. whether they were noticed or not.